for joining me today. Appreciate you being here. We have a lot to cover and a short period of time to cover it in, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We also do have a hard stop at 4, and the reason we have a hard stop at 4 is because I actually have to go present the findings of the usability evaluation I just completed. So I didn't have control of the schedule on that, and they put it right behind this one. So you'll notice that I don't know what I'm going to do with myself when I grow up. So I'm listed 3 times here. I am an adjunct professor at the university, but I run my own consulting firm. I've been teaching this particular course at this open house for 20 years. I've been teaching for closer to 30, and I've been a practitioner for closer to 45. So I do practice what I preach. And so I'm going to tell you some of the things that we do as a company, give you some background principles to it, and try to make sure that it makes sense to you. Because we're not together, I can't really ask a lot of the questions I typically do about whether you've done any testing before, or anything like that, why you were here and stuff. So I'm going to make some assumptions about you. I'm going to assume that you have some knowledge of the area, that many of you might have done some usability testing already, but I'm going to cover basically soup to nuts. But let's start with this. This particular course is accurately titled, as long as we do 2 things. First, as long as we replace the word usability, and secondly, as long as we replace the word testing. And so let me explain what I mean by that as a way to get us in here a bit. So first of all, usability versus the user experience. The term of art has morphed over the years. At one time we were HCI, another time we were being user friendly, and then it was all usability, and the latest term is user experience. I like user experience myself, but let's talk about what we mean as the distinction there. And so the first, if we look at what the formal definitions of usability are, we have 2 to choose from, and I like aspects of both. 9241, the international standard, says that usability is the set of attributes that bear on the effort needed for use. And what I like about this definition is its focus, the attributes, or it's referring to the attributes of the product. And how is it that the product makes it easy or difficult for a person to use it? And so I like this definition because of its strong focus on the product is the issue here. And so sometimes you hear people shorten the term to user testing, and that bothers me to hear that term, because we're not testing users, we're testing the design, we're using users to get there. And secondly, this definition does say it's not only their effort, but it's on their assessment of that use by a stated or implied set of users. So what they're saying is it's 2 aspects that we're worried about. How well do they use the product? But also, what do they think of the product as a separate element? The more common definition that we see is from 9241, and it says it's the extent to which the product can be used by specified users, that's common between both, to achieve specified goals. Then it says with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, ignore that for a minute, in a specified context of use. And so the definition here, what I like about it is, first of all, it brings in the idea that it's not only can they use it, but what are they using it for? Products have a specific purpose in mind, and if they're used in a way that they're not intended, then whether we're assessing that or worried about that is a different case. And that includes this context of use. And the example I usually use is the iPad versus the Kindle. And so Kindle makes a big point of the fact that you can read your books at poolside, and you can't do that on an iPad, and isn't an iPad bad for that reason? Well, if it was intended for that purpose in that context, then yes, it would be a bad design. But I don't think that Apple, I'm pretty sure that Apple is not particularly concerned about you reading books poolside. That wasn't its intended context of use. Now, you may disagree with their decision to do that, but the bottom line is we need to address all 3. Who are the users? What are they trying to accomplish? And in what context are they trying to accomplish it? And context is important in a number of ways, not just what physical environment are you in, but remember that a lot of these products are used in conjunction with something else. So, you may be sitting there working on your computer, But at the same time, you may be accessing some print material, or you may be on the phone while you're doing something on the computer. You may be using multiple apps. And when we're assessing one of them, one piece of the puzzle, we have to keep in mind the entire system and how it can be used in context. Another example I use for this for classes, we take the class as a system and we divide it up and we say, okay, if we look at the user being the student, you're supposed to be paying attention to what's going on and being presented, but you're also taking notes. And so if we're worried about your note-taking capability and we want to design something to assist you, we have to put it in the context that it's not the primary activity. Learning is the activity and note-taking supports that. So if we tested just note-taking without worrying about what you were trying to do at the same time, then we may be missing some of the puzzle. So the thing about usability is, and there's a great expression that Aaron Walters came up with. He said, a designer looking for usable, going for usable is like a chef aiming for edible. It misses some of the dimensions that we're talking about. And so what we're really talking about, oh, I'm sorry, I threw this in here and I forgot I added this. I want to recommend, at least for now, that even though you probably, if you've done this before, you've done some usability testing, you've probably heard of going out and checking for a product's effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, under the assumption that if you measure these three things, you're measuring usability. And I want to caution you that this is a dangerous place to go. Some people have tried to combine them together and come up with some Uber measure where you weight each one, but they've concluded that the relationship between effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction is what they call complex. Well, the reason it's complex is in some cases they're almost independent of each other. And so we need to look at what these mean. First of all, effectiveness, the most common measure for this is success rate. So the best thing to do when you're looking at a product is to say, can the user succeed? That's the root of the definition, the ability of people to accomplish an activity. So they either accomplish it or they don't. And to give them partial credit for almost accomplishing something gets us into an area we probably don't want to be. So think of effectiveness in this sense of, can they accomplish what they want to accomplish? Efficiency, the problem with efficiency is that it's too easy to measure efficiency by external measures like time on task or the number of keystrokes or mouse clicks or how many screens they had to access. And the problem with these measures of efficiency is that they're efficiency in the interface, but not in the user. And so remember that it is, how is the design of the product affect the effort by the user? Well, efficiency to the user is how much we think. So how much mental effort, cognitive load a system requires of us to use it is what we mean by efficiency. And so measuring these other measures are not important. You can have a system where users complete things very quickly, but they fail because they're rushed through it. So aiming for time on task by itself can be a problem. And satisfaction, as we talked about earlier, the first ISO definition separated them and said you have to know about both. I think acknowledging that these are very independent. And so we do collect it with subjective scales, and the most common being this, the system usability scale. There's others, there's the quiz, the SUMI, so on. But when you look at it from a practical standpoint, there's a way to view effectiveness and efficiency and satisfaction. And some of this information you will use if you're doing a quantitative assessment. I have qualitative in here twice, sorry. Some of this data is important if you're doing a quantitative assessment. Other data is important if you're doing a qualitative assessment. And we'll get into those terms in a second. But just going out and measure effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction may take us off in the wrong path. If you look at it from a practical standpoint, it goes this way. We want people to succeed with the product. So that's the most important thing we have to know. Can they succeed? If we have two designs that we have the same level of success, or we've reached a level of success we're comfortable with, can we improve the efficiency, as in, can we improve how difficult it is for a user to think their way through a design, but not worrying about these external measures. We may end up reducing the number of clicks. We may end up reducing the number of screens, but we may end up adding clicks or adding screens if we're focusing on the mental effort. And then finally, oops, I lost my third bullet in there. There it is. Efficiency. Oops, I'm back in the slide. Sorry, I'll get there. I have to do it the hard way. Sorry, give me a second. Picking up from here. So satisfaction is an interesting one because for most cases, satisfaction is independent of performance. Jeff Sorrow, who does a lot of work on doing analytics, numerical analytics, he did some testing of SUS scores against performance, and he found that it had a 0.24 correlation. And his conclusion was that he says approximately 6% of the satisfaction score is related to how well people use the product. A 6% correlation, or approximately 6% of the satisfaction score being accounted for in performance, might suggest that it's just a coincidence and it's not really related. And the reason for that is that we don't know how to monitor our own performance. I give you an example that we did some evaluation, my firm did some evaluation on voting systems. And we tested 5 different voting systems. One was paper. We had 4 electronic machines. We had a total of 5,000 people go through testing on these voting systems. And to a person, with one exception, 4,999 people said that they did fine, made no mistakes whatsoever, and that they would be more than happy to use this system in a real election. The last person said that they weren't sure they did fine, but they would be happy to use the system in a real election. But if you look at the performance data, 1/3 of the participants made 1 or more mistakes. So these don't correlate with each other. And then the best rule to remember is that from Margaret Mead, the sociologist, who said there's what people do, there's what people say they do, and there's what people say. And those are 3 completely different things. So at the extremes, if a system is extremely horrible and we recognize how badly we do with it, we're likely to say that it's a bad product. But there's a lot of gray area in between. And so we should consider these as independent measures of things. What we typically refer to when we ask people what they think is we call it their perceived usability, to make that distinction. And in the presentation I mentioned I'll be giving at 4 to one of my clients, one of the things we're trying to point out to them is people said the product was fabulous, but they had a lot of difficulty using it. And so we have to make sure that we don't get carried away with, oh, it's a great product because they said it was great. There's our quote from Aaron I mentioned. So I'm going to grab a little sample here for you. This is my favorite pen of all time because it demonstrates all of the dimensions of the user experience. Now, you'll notice that it is a pen and it has a plunger on the top of it. And so by knowing it's a pen, by its appearance, we bring some knowledge to interaction with it. We assume certain things about a pen. We assume its functionality. We assume it's for drawing or writing or creating some kind of stuff on paper, whether it's pencil or pen. I said it was a pen. It's a writing instrument. We also know from the fact that the top of the pen has a plunger on it how we're supposed to interact with it to some extent. So we'll push this plunger down to arm the pen. And in fact, that does arm the pen. However, if you press on it again, it does not disarm the pen. And this particular pen is a strange design because it has a little plunger on the side that you have to press to disarm it. So pressing it and arming it is fine, but you have to notice this, which is not hard because the human nature is that if you find something that sticks out, we tend to want to push it in. So you can learn that pretty quickly, and it's sticking out, it's odd, it's black on silver. So you notice it right away. But there's another problem with this pen, and I'll grab a piece of paper to demonstrate. And that is that, yes, it's a pen, and I will show you that it's a pen because I can, if I can get my screen to show it. This problem with the backgrounds. Anyway, I'll explain what I did. I just wrote in blue, but it turns out that I can also write in red. And it turns out that there's a third option on this pen, which is a plastic tip, because this pen is also a stylus. So it is a red pen, a blue pen, and a stylus. But looking at the pen, you would have no indication that that's the case. And the reason you can't tell that is because it lacks obviousness. You've probably seen a pen that writes in multiple colors and it has multiple plungers on it. And so that tells us that it does multiple things. And this pen tells you that by this bizarre way. There's a little band here. Again, I'm trying to get my camera to show it. There's a little band right there between one end and the other that's red, black, and blue. And that's supposed to tell you that it does three things. That band is not only tiny, but you'll notice that it also sits right under where I hold it. So when you're holding it, you can't tell its function. The way that you select the various options is bizarre. I've handed this out in classes, I've taken it to client meetings, and in all the years I've owned this thing, I've owned it since I owned a Palm Pilot. I think only about 5 people have ever figured it out. The way that you use it is you hold it sideways, you rotate it until the band shows the color you want, either blue, red, or black, then you arm it, then it's ready to use. Now that's extremely difficult to figure out. Why would you have to hold a pen sideways to arm it? And you'd have to recognize that it points up, and so many things about it. But notice that because I've explained it to you now, it's not particularly hard to do that. I know it, now that I know how to do it, I can do that easily. And in fact, this pen is so bizarre that if you and I were to meet each other sometime in the future, and you said, hey, can I see that pen you told me about? And I handed it to you, I'm going to bet you could remember what it does, because unique things like this will tend to stick in your mind. Now, it has another problem related to this bizarre behavior of arm, disarm a different way. And that is, I'm expected, because of my experience in other pens, to arm and disarm the same way. And so if I'm distracted for some reason, I'm talking to somebody, I'm rushing out the door, I go and I need to sign something. So I arm my pen, I sign it real quick. And because I'm distracted, I won't think about this being the pen that it is. I'll think about it as being a standard pen. I'll try to click it and put it in my pocket, and I'll draw on myself because it induces an error. But despite all of that, this is my favorite pen of all time, because it's so wild. It is such a crazy design, and it's a great demonstration. And so if we get past the idea of usable and we start to look at the dimensions, what we have is this. First of all, we have to have access to products. That accessibility means access. If you think of the access board, they started with giving physical access to things like curb cuts and so on. Access to information. So for everybody, whether you have some form of acknowledged disability or not, we need access. All right, so that's a precursor to anything. Secondly, we need to know whether it has the functions it's supposed to have. In this case, my wife bought this pen for me thinking it would be valuable because it's blue, red, and a stylus. Well, I never wrote in red when I graded papers, because a lot of red ink on a page of an exam scares the bejeebers out of people. So I always wrote in either blue or black, because often I was writing comments about how well they did. And there's no reason to go for a stylus that causes me to put down my device, manipulate this with 2 hands, find it in the first place. When I have a stylus right here, I got 10 of them, as Steve Jobs told us. And the Palm Pilot, the thing that this was purchased for, had a stylus right in the back of it. So functionally, this is not very useful to me, but if it had a pencil, a pen, and a highlighter, I would find it highly suitable for my use. So suitability depends on the intended use by the user. Again, we always go back to the user. Then you have to be able to discover it has the functions it has. So that gets us to functional discoverability. Once you discover it has a function, like this will write in 3 different colors, you have to figure out how to use it. So that's ease of learning, one of the dimensions we typically see in what we call a usability test, is, can people learn to use it, since we show them a product they've never seen before? But if they've seen a product and they've learned it, as I showed you, this product then has a question of ease of use. This pen is very low in its ease of learning scale, but it's not particularly low in ease of use. It's just weird and awkward. A product that you don't use very often has a third dimension we call usability, which is ease of recall. If you use a site on your product, a website or an application at your job every day to log your time, then you won't forget the nuances and the idiosyncrasies it has. But if you have an application that you require to use for vacation or sick leave that you use maybe once or twice a year, you're going to have to remember it next time you see it. And if it has some strange behavior to it, you're going to have to remember that behavior. So what we typically hear of as usability is actually ease of learning, ease of use, and possibly ease of recall, depending on whether the product is used frequently or not. Safety, I've already mentioned. This pen is not particularly safe. Safety in products online that we might be dealing with go beyond physical safety. They get into data safety. Can we do things without losing our data? Do we accidentally delete things? We have features in most of our products to assist us with that. We have a typical undo feature in many products. We have a trash can that holds on to things. So we know that people do things all the time they need to recover from. So that's another dimension of safety. But a lot of the work my company does happens to be in healthcare. And with healthcare, we also, and in other areas, we also have psychological safety. If you're explaining the probability of success of a medical treatment for cancer, and you're discussing it with a doctor, you're likely to refer to things like years of lives lost. But you would never want to discuss it in that way to a patient. To a patient, losing their life is not the way that they want to talk about treatment. So you talk about years of lives gained. And so we have to be careful in safety psychologically, as well as data, as well as physical, if you're dealing with a physical product. And then finally, we have subjective preference. So when we're looking at a product, we're not just looking at its safety. We're looking at all of these dimensions if we can, but note that some of them you can't look at the same time. You can't discover ease of learning and ease of use simultaneously. You have to get them past the learning curve to find out if they can successfully use a product. But can you do that in a single session? So recruiting people to come in and participate who've never used a product will address ease of use. But if you want to find out, or ease of learning rather, but if you want to learn about ease of use, you have to bring in people who already know the product. And that gets us into a question of, well, how well do they know the product? How proficient are they? Ease of recall is extremely hard to test because you have to have people who know the product and stop using it for a period of time. And you don't know what they do in between. And there's only one case I can recall in my career where the Navy tried to test ease of recall on a particular product. So it's not very common, but we do have to worry about it, and we do have to assess it if we're truly assessing a product. Safety we can potentially assess, but it's a little difficult, and the disruptive nature of what we do can mask that. And then again, subjective preference is something we always are interested in because we're talking to humans. And it's very complicated how people determine their subjective preference of a product. So that takes care of the usability question. Why do I say we also have to replace the word test? Well, the problem with the word test is it's a little too strong. So the idea that we call usability testing, it's been around for years. It was popularized in the 90s, so it's at least 20 some odd years old now. Jacob Nielsen and the press picked up on it, and we started using this term usability testing. But it really refers to a lot of different forms of both user and non-user based evaluation. And so I think it's too strong a term and should be applied only when we're doing a true test. And so I tend to refer to what we do as either an assessment or an evaluation. So with that as an intro, we also have to consider the nature of what we're doing in terms of, are we after a quantitative test? Are we truly doing a test? And that implies something called quantitative research. Now, You may know the term. If you don't know the term, you probably know the alternate term that's being used. But let me start with the formal term of quantitative evaluation. It's focusing on numeric and unchanging data. It's looking at convergent reasoning, not divergent reasoning. Sounds very complicated. The bottom line is that if you want to determine whether one product is actually different from another product, you have to do and you not want to do that with some level of assurance. You have to do it in a way that is quantitative in nature. If you want to take a small population and then project how the total population might perform, you're going to have to do that in a quantitative way. And so the goal of quantitative research is to draw a conclusion that is valid and that has some known or acceptable level of uncertainty, because we're never certain. Okay. So trivial example, if you wanted to know this is my example from class, if I'm teaching this into a group of students at a university, and I say, well, I'm curious to know what the average height of people in the university is, the only way to know that for certain is to take everybody at the university that day and measure their height and average it. But I don't have access to everybody, so I'm going to use my classroom as the sample. Mathematically, I could take my sample, determine the average, knowing my sample versus the size of my sample versus the size of the total university. I can then draw a conclusion that the average height is probably between two numbers, but I'm never going to be certain of that without getting everybody. So this is the nature of quantitative assessment, is that you're collecting data that is solid, that is not going to move around, and then you're going to try to extrapolate that. Now, again, that's for projecting to a larger population. We can do the same thing if we said, the people in computer science are shorter than the people who are in the arts, is our hypothesis, and we could do that in a quantitative way. When we're talking about quantitative assessments, you might, as I mentioned, you might not have heard the term, but the usability community commonly refers to this as a summative test. And so this is right from the Usability Book of Knowledge. It's used to obtain measures, to establish a benchmark, or to compare results. That's the way I just described it, I hope. It should be task-based. It should tie directly to requirements, including results from analytic tools, blah, 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 time on task, error rates, user satisfaction. The purpose is to evaluate the product through defined measures. Now notice this, rather than diagnosis and correction of problems. So its goal is not to figure out what was wrong and what you're going to do about it. And that will get us into trouble if we try to do it. So it says the procedure is similar to a controlled experiment. In actuality, it is a controlled experiment. And so this term that they use, summative testing, is the equivalent of quantitative research. The term summative I don't tend to use because it has a very different meaning in education. Contrast, and to add to that, this idea that, okay, if we're going to do a quantitative assessment, are we going to be able to do that if we're going to stop and do a day of testing on a product? Well, the answer is no. The size of your uncertainty, how sure you are of your answer, is going to vary with your population size. And so there's a strong relationship there. And there's a general rule of thumb for research that says if you're looking for something that has a medium effect, it's not a small difference, but it's at least a medium size, you have to test somewhere between 25 and 30 people in order to see the data start to regress to the mean, start to reach its data point. You'll start to see where it's going. But that 25 to 30 people have to be all the same type of people. You can't be looking at different audiences. So you can't be looking at people who know the product and don't know the product, or people who are of a certain, they have a certain skill set, they're extremely proficient with a computer, versus those who are unfamiliar with a computer. So it's 25 to 30 people within one population. And if we look at statistics books, they give us a very different idea that says, if you have a population size of 100,000 people, you're going to need to sample 800 people to draw a conclusion. That's not going to happen in most projects if you're designing a product. So this kind of evaluation really can't occur as part of the design process, but it can occur after the fact. And so here's an example. You own a company and you sell on the web, and you've been selling products for years, but you've always required people to register before they use your product. And somebody got this idea that maybe you would sell more if you let people check out as a guest instead. And your boss thinks that it's worth a try, but only if you can prove to them, proof that this will actually increase sales. In fact, you better prove this. Otherwise, if it does something like reduce sales, you could get fired. So you need solid evidence before you're going to go forward. So you could set this up as an experiment. What you would do first is you would define what the change would be, the dependent variable that you're looking for. And in this case, it could be the number of sales. It could even be the number of abandoned shopping carts, right? They had it in the shopping cart, but when they reached the end, we were talking about doing an actual qualitative evaluation or summative test. So we know that the idea is that we want to see if we get more sales. So we can measure sales. We can measure volume of sales. We can measure dollar amount of sales. We could, if we wanted to, measure abandoned shopping. Regardless, we have to measure something that's on the direct path of what we're looking at. We then could create a site that has this capability in it. As long as we make no other changes and we run them at the same time, we can now do a comparison. Now, there's a little noise in the data because if you set up two servers, one that has checkout with a guest and one that has checkout without guest, and somebody comes in while you're running the study and they happen to go to the other server, then they'll experience it differently. So the same person could have two experiences. But you can actually set this up pretty nicely, that what you do is you route every person who shows up alternately to one server or the other. And if you have 10,000 visitors in a month or 2 or 3 months, you'll end up with a nice 5,000 person study going on. When you do, you run it for as long as you need, and then you look at the data, and I can pretty much guarantee you that you will see a difference. And it will be in the difference of the preference for people to buy without having to sign up as a guest. And this was actually done. It's believed that it was done by Amazon in their decision to move to this. But notice a couple of things. All we can collect from people is the endpoint. Did they succeed in purchasing? Did they finish the purchase process? But if they didn't, we don't know why. We don't know how satisfied they are or anything else. If we had stopped and tried to figuring that out, we could have disrupted whether this was the real data we were going to get. This was done without them knowing it, which makes this a more realistic setting. And there are companies that will do this. Another one that does it that we know of is Netflix. But also notice that we had a finished design. This didn't help us get to the design. This told us once we had. Now, if we contrast that with the idea of doing a qualitative research, and again, starting with the formal definition of it's an examination, analysis, and interpretation of observations for the purpose of discovering meaning and patterns of relationships, including classification of phenomena and entities in a manner that does not involve mathematical models. The goal here is to identify and understand any problem that occurs and possibly explore some solution. So if I have a hallway and I expect people to walk down that hallway and I know that 50 people went in and 50 people come out, then I know that the hallway was a success. If, however, I noticed 50 people came out and a number of them were limping, there was a problem in the process, but I don't know what it is because I couldn't do anything about it if I just wanted to see if the hallway was successful. But if I think there's a quality issue in there, I'm going to go figure out what it is. Now I go into the hallway and I discover that the rug in the hallway has got a bubble in it in one spot. I can make an assumption that that bubble is probably causing some people to trip and twist their ankle. So if I were doing a quantitative assessment, I have to run a number of people through there. I'd have to see how many of them tripped. I'd have to calculate the tripping probability against the total population. But if I'm doing qualitative research, I don't even have to see a person walk by and say a bubble in the rug is a bad idea. If I'm not sure it is and I let one person trip over it, I don't need to let a dozen people trip over it. So qualitative research is really looking for enough data to make a decision. And if we look at the definition compared to what the usability community again refers to this, if you've heard of it, you've probably heard of it in what they call formative testing. And they use the term that it's helped to form the design. It involves evaluating a product during development, or it's the goal of detecting and eliminating usability problems. The problem with the definition is if you look at the second portion of it, it doesn't completely distinguish itself from being able to do these two things at the same time. Formative evaluation is that the audience for the observation and recommendation of the project team itself used to immediately improve the design of the product or service and redefine the specifications that are less formal than summative, suits the needs of designers, developers, project managers, other project participants. Okay, so the idea is one of them says, was I successful? The other approach says, why was I successful? How, when I was I successful at a level that I'm comfortable with in efficiency, for instance, and in satisfaction? So again, the collection of this data depends on which type we're doing. So you need to decide which one to do. You're not going to be able to do both. If you try to collect quantitative data, but you try to assess the problems you encounter, that data is corrupted. You cannot do both. So decide which one it is. And since we're talking, I assume, in evaluating something while it's being designed, we're almost always doing qualitative assessment. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. Do it right, know when you're going to do the other one. As the Dalai Lama said, know the rules well so you can break them appropriately. The lack of understanding of this has led to some interesting cases. So for instance, there was an evaluation done some years ago. They brought in 10 people to look at an HHS website. Those 10 people were supposed to represent the 10 user audiences. So imagine they had one person representing an entire population of their users. But they published the results and said, the published articles on this said, according to research, 40% of people can't find what they're looking for. Now that's a quantitative conclusion to a study that can't possibly conclude that off of 10 people, each one being a unique person from a unique audience. So you can't make these jumps and assumptions. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that they went for the negative and not said, well, hey, 60% of people can find what they're looking for. The EPA wanted to add usability as a factor in giving their Energy Star compliance rating to products. And so they were trying to devise a test to do that. And the problem is that they came up with a series of tasks, but not every thermostat supported it. And so in their protocol, they said, well, it doesn't matter. We'll just evaluate the ones they can perform. So they're not even equating equal things together. They came up with a special formula that penalized people the longer they did the task, of the assumption that that was why people wouldn't use it, is, oh, it just got too hard to use, I'm going to stop trying. There's no evidence that that's the case, and there's no evidence that their formula made any sense. And then they had people do the task while they were thinking out loud, the protocol you might be familiar with. They were being timed while they were talking. If they didn't finish in the expected amount of time, they were told, time's up, you failed, let's move to the next task. Imagine telling the participant as you go, every time they failed, what it's going to do to subsequent attempts. And then when they were done, they had a number and they said, well, this will be the number we use. And I said to them, well, where's your confidence interval? Because you're dealing with a sample. And they said, well, we don't know how to calculate the confidence interval on the formula we created, so we're not going to use it. Well, just because you don't know how to do it doesn't mean it's not important. So again, I mean, some people, even in high levels of the organization, might not understand these distinctions. New York Times reported on the opinions of people, and they concluded that 40% of the consumers judged the credibility site on its visual appeal, and only 7.6% of healthcare experts did. And therefore, users, the general public, were assessing websites incorrectly. The problem is they were looking at what people said that they thought about the website, not what they actually did. If you look at the results, 8 of the 10 websites selected by both of them were identical, and the order was only slightly different. So what they were doing and what they say they were doing didn't match, but the study didn't acknowledge that. And finally, the government, I one time produced an RFP, a request for proposal, on what they called a performance-based contract. You would only get paid if you showed that you performed well enough. And the way they wanted you to show you performed well enough was you had to redesign their website and then prove that it performed better than the earlier website with 8 people. But you couldn't even compare it to the original website. And well, how could you possibly make a comparison to a site that you don't have? What are you comparing it to? And secondly, how can you do this with 8 people? Well, if I got the contract, what I would do is I'd say, well, we have to do it twice. And the first time I'll recruit a bunch of people who are really bad at the web, and then I'll bring a bunch of people who are really good at the web, and then I'll show a difference and not show you confidence intervals, and I can kind of win. But this doesn't make any sense to do. So after all of that, welcome to assessing the user experience. And we're going to focus primarily on the idea of qualitative assessment, since that's mostly what I think you'll be dealing with. Now, assessing the quality of the quality of their performance also makes us understand something about the user that I want to point out. And I should tell you that my background, I'm a human factors engineer by title. And what that means, if you're not familiar with it, is that my degrees are both in engineering and in psychology. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about psychology here before we go any farther, and it's this. We have 2 processes that go on in our brain, which we cleverly call System 1 and System 2. We've long time assumed that your body was the engine and your consciousness was the driver of the engine, and that's just wrong. There's 2 analogies that I often use, but I like Dan Gilbert's version of it. He talked about trying to ride a donkey on the Grand Canyon on a vacation one time. Now, Dan, being a psychologist and not a professional donkey rider, and if you've never seen the Grand Canyon, I'll tell you that it's very tall and the path that you're on is very narrow. And so it's kind of an unnerving experience to do something unfamiliar like riding a donkey on a narrow path on top of a very steep cliff and hope you can do it right. And so Dan described an event as he was coming up to a curve where he was worried that he might not steer this donkey correctly and the 2 of them were going off the cliff. And he was afraid that if he didn't steer, if he steered too hard, he could bump into somebody else, maybe knock them off the cliff. And so Dan did what most people do when they're faced with an experience like this, where they can't make a quick decision. He didn't do anything. He froze. And when he froze, the donkey walked around the corner on its own, because the donkey isn't stupid enough to wait for you to tell it what to do. It has its own brain. And what Dan said about this is that this is really the way that our mind works, is that we have 2 levels of processes going on. One is an underlying process we call System 1, which is all of our automated and unconscious processes. And we have a second process called System 2. Sorry, let me go back a second. Come on, go back a second. It's always easier to do it this way. Oh, I did it again. All right, 1 too many clicks. Don't count clicks on me. There, don't touch it. So the unconscious processes that we have going on are thousands or hundreds or even millions of processes going on simultaneously. They're doing tons of things. They're making almost all of the decisions in our life. They're deciding, how to walk and talk and breathe and regulate your temperature and keep you upright in a chair and everything else. We have a thread of consciousness. One of the threads in our brain is the single thread of consciousness. And that single thread of consciousness is slow compared to what the unconscious can do. And we could not function in the world. We could not make decisions like avoid the oncoming car or blink your eye because there's something approaching that could hit you in the face and damage your eye if we did everything consciously. So the reality is that our unconscious process is what's having us interact with the world. And consciousness, we could think of more like the rider on the back of an elephant. We are likely to be able to influence what we're doing, but we're not in control of what we're doing. we learn through consciousness, but we also can learn things without ever being conscious of it. And so we take credit, as the conscious mind takes credit for all the things you do in your life that you don't really control. A simple example is, I suspect for some of you, you might have started to get out of the shower and realized you didn't wash your hair. And you stop and go back to wash your hair and discover you actually washed your hair. And the reason for that is that you don't wash your hair. What you do instead is you witness your hair being washed consciously, but it's an unconscious process. You've been doing it way too long. And so you can actually get distracted and not notice yourself wash your hair and it be done. If that example doesn't resonate with you, let me show you a video here to show you what's going on with your conscious mind. So I'm going to see if this video plays properly. There we go. Hope you can see that.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
All right, hopefully you saw that time. Back to my slides now. There we go. So what happened there, if you didn't see the moonwalking bear both times, and unfortunately I can't ask, I guess I can ask everybody if you can type in and tell whether you did or not. But what happens in that situation, and you can try it again later, is that your conscious mind was told to count passes. And during that process, a lot of unconscious things were happening. One of the unconscious things that happened, and we know this because of looking at the eye tracking data on participants in this study, is that your eye might have been directed to the bear for a moment, but then your unconscious mind said, wait a minute, this bear is not pertinent to this task. Move away from that and get back to counting. And as a result, you don't process the fact that your eye actually went over and looked at the bear, and you don't consciously recall ever seeing the bear. And so the unconscious mind is making lots of decisions for you, but your conscious mind is doing this slow process of counting passes, and the unconscious mind can do lots of things in the background much faster. And that's the way that we operate, is that the unconscious mind is doing the routine stuff, so that, and we have to focus our conscious mind on the unique thing that we're trying to accomplish. And so what happens with our behavior is that as we learn to do things, it becomes an unconscious process and we stop being aware of it. And it's that reason that we can function in life, is that we see things, we learn things, we go unconscious, they go into the unconscious, and then we can go focus on something else. Once it gets into unconscious, it's really difficult for us to access it, as we think of this as expert behavior. And so I'm going to demonstrate to all of you right now that you guys don't know how to drive your own car. And so I can't see you, your cameras aren't on, it's fine, but I'm going to show you what I would like you to do. And if you'll bear with me and do this, I think I can prove this to you, is I'd like you to put your hands as though you were steering a car. And I want you to assume a couple of things, that there's no cop around, so you don't have to worry about turning indicators or anything like that. Just keep your hands on the wheel. I don't want you to look in the rearview mirror or do any of that. I want you to simulate with your hands the actions you take if you wanted to move your car from this position to the lane that's to your right, okay? So on the count of 3, I want you to show me with your hands, show yourself with your hands what you're doing. Pay attention to what your hands are doing and make sure you get it right, because it's important, you're driving a car. So on the count of 3, show yourself what your hands do, okay? 1, 2, 3, go. Now, without seeing you, I'm going to suggest we might want to do it a second time, because for some of you, I suspect you might have done this, And if you did, then you're actually doing this in your car, and that's not changing lanes, that's circling. So let's repeat that one more time, and be careful. This is a car you're driving. So show me your hand motions to move from this lane to that lane. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay. And again, without seeing you, I'm going to predict that you're all dead, because every single one of you did this. Now, you may have done a short one, you may have done a long one, but you did that, assuming that that's how you drive your car. And if you did, notice what happens. You turn the wheel, the car turns in that direction, you straighten the wheel out. You're driving diagonally across the highway. You're going to be dead in a few minutes. That's not how you drive the car. The way you drive your car to change lanes is you turn the wheel and the car moves to that lane. You turn it back to straighten it, but then you have to turn it this way the same degree in order to get it to straighten out again. Then you come back to center. So you do this to change lanes. But you're not aware of that because it's an unconscious process. And so this will become important. Bear with me. When we're designing a product, what we need to do is when we're assessing whether a product is designed properly, we need to assess, can the user keep their conscious focus on the activity they are trying to get done? What is their goal? And can they interact with it essentially unconsciously? Because the interaction is an unconscious process. So that's the goal of interaction design. That's the goal of what we should be assessing. Let me show you an example. My son when he was in high school, called me up one morning and said, "Hey, I need to have you pay for my AP exams that I'm going to take." And I said, "No problem. When you get home tonight, we'll take care of it." And he said, "No, I'm driving to campus now. I need you to pay for them." Okay, great. I'm in the middle of doing something, but I need to stop and do this right away because we're not far from the school. So I go to the website and I'm going to have to pay for classes. And so I said to him, "Okay, well, what AP classes are you taking?" And he said, "Well, I'm taking AP English, I'm taking AP Biology, and I'm taking AP Psychology." So, okay, I'll go take care of it. So I come to the website and I'm looking here and I'm trying to figure out, where do I go to pay for his AP exams? I see, the possibility that it's purchasing. It could be academics. It turns out that it's neither of those. It turns out it's under parents. So I go to parents and I get this link farm. And I have to read through all of these links that are styled in a way that it's kind of difficult to notice them. They're not organized at all. But if you look in the lower end of the second column, you'll see that there is something called online fee payments. You'll notice some of these are rendered a little differently because I clicked on 3 of them before I got there. And when I finally found online fee payments, I then came to this page. And then I had to go again and figure out which of these pages, and it's the academic advanced placement fee, the test fees. So I click on that, and then I'm presented with this page. And now I'm looking at this page and saying, okay, well, I don't see anything. There's no checkbox symbol on the right, left to select. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this page. So I got to figure out what to do. When I move my cursor around, the cursor actually as a yellow bar that slides up and down. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe I need to click, maybe that does it. So I click and sure enough, it does it. And then I'm thinking, well, I wonder if I can click all the courses at the same time, or do I have to do them one at a time? Well, I'll be safe. I'll just do them one at a time, but I don't see what to do now that I've clicked it. Well, if you look at the bottom of the page, buried just off the page is a button down there. And that button says, add selected items to shopping cart, which is a blue button on a blue background underneath a ton of text. And it's on the bottom of the screen that my screen wasn't even that small. And so now I know how to get through this process, but let me ask this question. Do you remember what the 3 courses were we were trying to pay for? And so this is the problem, is that the user's activity is what should be in their conscious mind. How they need to interact with the computer to get that activity accomplished is not something they should have to think about. Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, is great by its title alone, that's exactly what designers should do. They should design it in a way that you don't have to think about the product. Ben calls this product transparency. the product itself should be transparent. He told a story once many, many years ago where he had people come to him after they'd been to the Library of Congress, and they had used his kiosk, and they were very proud of, you know, the design. And they told him that. They said, "Oh, you did a great job. That kiosk was wonderful." And he said, "Oh man, that's disappointing." And they're like, "Why would you be disappointed?" So, because you were there to learn about stuff at the Library of Congress. You weren't there to pay attention to my kiosk. And the fact that you were aware of my design means I failed. So this idea that the design itself, the interaction with design should be transparent, will dictate how we need to evaluate them. Now, when we're dealing with participants, and I'm keeping my eye on the clock here because I know we're short on time, or we have a very limited time. When we are dealing with participants and we're trying to figure this thing out, there's some things about them that we have to be careful and understand. So let's go through a few of those. When you are observing a person, when you're sitting next to them and you're watching them, you will influence what they do. This is known as social facilitation, or the observer effect. And the observer effect is a number of various names in the psychology world. But what we're saying is that simply by being observed, you will affect another person's behavior. If you've ever been a runner, I many years ago, well, not that many years ago, but some years ago, I got into running. I was going to run a half marathon. And I, at the point, I'd never run anything close to that. And when I was approaching the race date, I'd only run 10 miles of the 13 I was supposed to run. And one of my students happened to be a marathon runner. And I said, "I'm really concerned about this." And he said, "Well, how far have you run so far?" And I said, "The most I've ever run is 10 miles. And he said, "Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. The crowd will carry you the rest of the way." Well, wow, what does that mean? Well, when you're in that race setting and you're running with a bunch of other people and there's a crowd there cheering you on, they influence you, and you tend to do this. You tend to perform better. And sure enough, I had never run 13 miles until the day of the race. I ran 10 was my max. I rested a week as he recommended, and I went down and ran 13 miles. The thing about this observer effect, though, is a little dangerous in that it can not only show improvement in behavior, that level of social facilitation, but it can also unnerve some people. And so what we see is behavior split. And those who are proficient at a task will become better at it because they're showing off, not consciously, but just that's the nature of being around other people. Or they will get nervous and they'll perform less. They'll have more difficulty. And so when we're doing evaluations and we're watching people in order to see what's happening, know that the effect that you're getting is not real. It's probably either exaggerated good or exaggerated bad. No one is exempt from some type of social facilitation. The most common one is known as the Hawthorne effect. And just if you've heard of it, I'll tell you a little story about it you might not know. And if you haven't heard of it, there was a study done back before it was back in the 30s, before we had like breaks in manual labor days. Every 2 hours, you take a 15-minute break. And Hawthorne, unfortunately, is not the name of the researcher in this case, but the name of the plant in I think it was in New Jersey, where they made relays. And they brought in a researcher to see if he could improve performance. And so he tried various things. And so one of the things he tried was he increased the lighting. And sure enough, he had 2 shifts, so he could do a comparison. And so he'd raise the lighting on one shift and their performance would increase. And so he'd raise the lighting on the other shift and balance them out. And then he'd move on to something else. And so he added a break and he saw the performance increase. So he added a break to both groups. And then, he tried, some other things. And he kept trying various things and they all seemed to have an effect. And so when he was done, he said, "Okay, I've got plenty of data. I'll go write up my report." He left and the plant reduced everything. They took everything away from them. So they reduced the lighting back to its old level. They took out the break. They took out the hot meal. And productivity was the highest it had been yet. It wasn't necessarily what he did that mattered. It was that people knew that somehow somebody was observing their behavior. And so they were performing for that. So that's the Hawthorne effect, is one of its great examples. What's interesting is that even the illusion of being observed has an effect. And so I was a researcher this is one of the studies, is that if you put a mirror in a room and you put a marshmallow in front of a child and tell them not to eat it, They're less likely to eat that marshmallow if there's a mirror in the room and they're aware of themselves watching themselves. Melissa Bateson at Newcastle did an experiment in her own psychology department where over top of the coffee and donut donation box, she would change the poster. And if the poster was a seascape or a tree or something, people donated at a certain rate. But if she put a poster up that had a picture of a person on it and they had eyeballs, or even an animal with an eyeball in it, then people contributed 3 times as much on the other weeks. So it's a powerful effect. And we just, when we're doing these evaluations, just be aware that you're influencing it. So don't take what you see as natural behavior. Another one that we run into is when we ask people their opinions, and this is known as confabulation. And so the origin of confabulation is kind of an interesting story. It came from the study in people in split brains during the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. There was an experiment to help people with seizures, grand mal epileptic seizures, where they severed the connection between the 2 hemispheres, the corpus callosum. And you can survive with 2 hemispheres that don't communicate with each other. But interesting things happen, like one hand would button your shirt and the other hand is unbuttoning your shirt at the same time because they're not coordinated, the 2 hemispheres. But what's interesting about the hemispheres is that the left and the right hemisphere process information from the eyes differently. So the left half of both eyes is processed by the right hemisphere, and the right half of both eyes is processed by the left hemisphere. And by a trick of showing images to people, we can show an image to one hemisphere or the other, okay? Bear with me, this is gonna have a point. So what they did was they showed people pictures of a chicken, and then they said, and they showed it to one hemisphere, and then they said, okay, point to an array of pictures here, which one goes with what you just saw? And they point at it, and it's they showed them a chicken leg, and they pointed at chicken. And they said, well, why did you do that? Well, the hemisphere that saw it had speech in it, and so it was able to articulate it. Well, you showed me a picture of a chicken, and so a chicken leg, and the chicken leg belongs to a chicken, so that's why I pointed at the chicken. Well, it makes good sense. Then they showed a picture to the other hemisphere that doesn't speak, and that picture was of a car buried in the snow. Now, just because it doesn't speak doesn't mean it can't function, and so when they asked this person to now point at a picture in an array that they wanted to point to that was related to what they were looking at, they pointed to a shovel. But then they asked the people, why did you point to the shovel? Now, remember that one hemisphere saw the car in the snow. That hemisphere controlled the hand to point at the picture. But the other hemisphere is completely unaware of this event because the 2 hemispheres can't communicate. And so when they said to them, what is it why are you pointing at a shovel? The person thought for a second, and what they all said was, well, chickens poop and you have to clean the poop up with something, so I'd use a shovel. This is the same nature. Remember I said that when you learn something, it goes into unconscious. When we ask people the dreaded why question, why did you click on that? Why didn't you notice X? It's a challenge to them. You have to come up with an explanation. When they come up with that explanation, what really happened occurred in the unconscious mind. And then you ask them why, they will give you lots of interesting answers. So one example from some work that I was doing was this particular website had placed login in the middle of the menu, the left side menu. Now, watching people use the site, when the task came up to log into the site, they looked in the upper right-hand corner where they expected it to be. They looked at the bottom of the website where they expected it to be. They scrolled through the menu where they didn't expect it to be, possibly didn't go far enough, possibly did, but it just didn't register. It was a moonwalking bear to them. But my client wanted me to ask them why they didn't notice it. And I said, well, you can ask them, but you're not going to get a good answer. And they said, well, ask them anyway. So I did. Oh, the font's too small. It's the same font as all the rest of the fonts. Oh, it's in the wrong color. Why would you have one menu item in a different color? That might solve the problem, but that's not why you missed it. All of these answers are an attempt to rationalize something that occurred outside of their awareness. And the thing about the confabulation, when you ask them this question, what makes confabulation and dangerous is they're not lying to you. They're rationalizing from the unconscious. They believe themselves, and you will believe their sincerity. And so a lot of people will report these strange answers from people. If you ask 5 people, you're going to get 5 answers. It's not going to be the same answer, and they're all probably made up and wrong. So another thing we have to be careful about is when we ask them, which we have to do, if they know why something happened, be careful in the answer you get back. Related to that is something called answer substitution, where you ask them a question, but they actually give you an answer to a different question. I don't want to waste too much time talking about it. Projected responding, though, is another very important one. And it has to do with people's attempts to understand our goal, which anybody in the situation, their intuition is going to be heightened. They're going to be trying to pay attention to you, because if you are with them and they're trying the product, but you're with them, they're watching your reaction to what they do. And if they get some feedback, they will start to respond to the feedback they got. So imagine that you're doing this and they go, ooh, and you grab a piece of paper and you write down, ooh. Oh, you said ooh at this point. That's important. I better write that down. Now, the next time that they do something and they go, wow, you grab your piece of paper and you write down, wow. And what you're doing is you're training them that you want to find cases where they can ooh and wow. And they'll start to ooh and wow for you. They'll start to find cases for you because they got this message, maybe even unconsciously, that that's their goal here. If they've gotten some feedback from you that suggests that you don't like this product and that's your goal, they will find reasons for you not to like this product. If you somehow project that you want this product to succeed, they might find things to help you find why this product succeeds. So you have to be as neutral as you can in any response. And remember that these responses are not necessarily conscious responses. Your writing is an unconscious message to them that that's important enough, I should repeat it. It's actually a form of learning called operant conditioning. So it's one of the reasons why I tell people, if you're ever in a usability evaluation, you can't take notes. Or if you feel compelled to take notes, you can't stop. Because note-taking versus non-note-taking is a telegraph. And it's really, really hard to avoid getting this message across to people because of the nature of how you're going to interact with them, which we'll get to in a moment. And finally, I'm going to show you a poster that I had to recreate because I couldn't find the original online anywhere, which surprised me. But let me give you a moment to just take a look at this poster. This is from the Canon people, the ones who make lenses. There was some work done some years ago known as the Q studies. And there's been a long debate. It actually started at George Mason when, dropping his name right now, one of the professors there made a comment that the reason why usability studies had data that was always showing such divergent information is because they weren't controlled enough. And he raised a lot of ire that he was suggesting people weren't doing it right. And he's like, no. He ended up having to author an entire chapter of the Human Factors Journal where this discussion came in. The Q studies came out later, and what they showed was that they gave an assignment to various teams of people and told them exactly what they wanted them to evaluate, and they claimed to know what was wrong with the product, and they showed that every team ended up with different results. And the reason why every team ends up with different results, again, is that this is the nature of a small group of people that we're observing, and we're interpreting their behavior, and we see what we are trained to see. If you're a visual designer, you see improper use of negative white space. If you're a cognitive psychologist, then you see issues in conceptual model development. If you're a developer, you see coding issues. So we all see what we're trained to see, and we can't always expect everybody to see the same thing. That's one of the reasons why in the evaluations that I do, we always have at least 2 people observe. Having one person assume that they're going to catch everything is unlikely. 2 people is better, 3 would be even more, but it starts to get costly to my clients. And again, when we talk about the nature of the people who are going to participate in the study, if we're talking about a qualitative assessment, a typical qualitative evaluation follows some interesting rules. We're only going to be testing with a couple of people, and a couple is a relative term, okay? But it's done with very few people per round. It's not high enough to be drawing any statistical assessment of results. The thing that one of the lines that I laughed at, with not in front of my client, but later to myself, when they said to me, we had one participant fail to show, and they said, oh gosh, we have to replace them. I said, well, you know, it's only one of our participants. They said, well, we can't make a decision just based on 8 people. And I thought, well, sure, but we can't make a decision just based on 9. I mean, if you can't do 8, you can't do 9. That's not a magic number. Jacob Nielsen will claim that you only need 5 people and you can get 80% of your usability problems. And if you know that study, that's wrong. I'm sorry, Jacob, but that's proved wrong. It fundamentally flawed in the analysis that came to this. It's been debated for years. It's been shown why this is wrong in a number of studies, but it's on the internet and therefore it's true. Don't believe it, but do believe that 5 people is probably enough to get some data. Steve Krug says you only need 2 or 3 people. You can grab them you can grab them in the hallway, and yeah, 2 or 3 people, you can probably get some data. I wouldn't grab anybody, but a couple of people could probably show you some problems. And that's not because of the magic number 2 or 3. That's because a lot of products are so poorly designed. But if you have a really well-designed product, 2 or 3 people may not be anywhere near enough. Practical standpoint, you need to carve out some time to do some evaluation. The design team, assuming you're doing a split design development, which you should be doing, or your team should be doing, or a client should be doing, a standard user-centered design process, we still have to get stuff done quickly. If it's in the middle of an agile sprint, it's even more important you get it done quickly. So often we can get a day where we can do an evaluation. And so if you think about it, in a day, how many people could you cover? 8 or 9, it's about the most you could do. Now, 8 or 9 people in a day, for me, my day starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and finishes at 9 o'clock at night. And so I might get an 8, 9, 10, and then a break, and then there's 11 and a 12, maybe a 1 o'clock, and then a break, and then there's a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slot. And I can get 8 or 9 people. But remember, again, one person is not going to tell you about an audience. And so the rule that we use, rule of thumb, is 1 person's never sufficient. 2 people is better, but 3 people is the minimum you should consider for any particular audience group that you're going to recruit. Balance that against the idea that you can get 8 or 9 done in a day. You could potentially bring in 3 user groups, right? I'm going to bring in people who are inexperienced with the web and of this age group. And then I want to bring people who are inexperienced with the web and in this older age population. And then I want to bring in people who are experienced with the web, but I'm talking 3 different groups, and that's it, because I got 9 people. You lose one, yeah, okay, you know, then it's not great, but you don't target a single person in any population. If we talk about some things I'm going to talk about in a minute relate to the nature of the people we get. And so just know this, we hear, oh, I went out and I randomly picked some people to participate. Well, that's not generally true. My students will tell me that they went to the student union and randomly picked people. No, they picked the people who were at the student union who looked approachable at that moment. They used some criteria. If you're doing a full quantitative research evaluation, you use stratified sampling, but know that we're doing what's known as convenience sampling. And so these people, if nothing else, for me, my company, we typically hire a recruiting firm. The people that they select are generally in a database. So they all have been selected to be had agreed to be in the database. Again, the statistical evaluations we're talking about can't be done if you're not talking about randomly sampled homogeneous populations. But when you're talking about getting enough data to make a decision, then convenience sampling is good, but you can't be irrational about who you select. I had one of my clients called me and said, somebody's proposing to do an evaluation, and what they're doing is they're asking the team members to pretend to be the profiles for this site. I was like, no, you can't pretend to be somebody else. And that may be super convenient, but that's over convenient. You could ask your friends and family, as Steve Krug would suggest, or grab anybody in the hallway. That's too convenient. So convenience simply means that we're not doing the rigorous work, but we're not being too trivial about it at the same time. And I mentioned the 14th Dalai Lama's rule, which keeps applying to everything I'm telling you. All right, we're finally into getting now deeper, now we understand the rules, into getting ready to run an evaluation. Some years ago, a group took over the FDA's, a new group came in and was running the FDA's medical evaluation side. And one of the things that they put out when they said, look, we're going to have to stop doing the evaluations we've been doing because everybody keeps telling us what people have done and how well they've done it on a bunch of tasks. And that's great, but we need to know more than that. We need to know, why did they have problems with these particular tasks? And we need to know that the right tasks were selected. And so task selection is an important aspect because we can't test an entire product, hardly ever. There's too many parts of a product for us to evaluate. So we're going to be judicious about where we come up with these tasks. And to do that, one of the things you can do is when you get a product that you're going to evaluate, you need to evaluate it against common style guides. Now, if you're on a mobile device, there's a given style guide. It's the spelling and grammar checker of your product. It's going to tell you, whether the OK and cancel button should be left, right, or right, left. It tells you what the menu should be, what a hamburger menu looks like in a mobile app and what position it's in. And you follow these rules because these are the things like the pen that has a plunger on it that tells us something. These are the basics, but it doesn't mean your product is going to be particularly good just because you follow the basics, but these should not be violated. Anybody can do this evaluation. And if you can take care of it, you're going to knock out these small level things. But if you happen to encounter a site that or a product that has these problems, these are the things that you might say, well, I think because they did a different style here than traditional, we might want to evaluate that. Or we know that this is wrong and we're just going to point it out even before we get to bringing in users. We'll get to what you deliver as your results in a couple of minutes, but you should be looking at the product first to say, what's good or bad about this product, because that could determine how I'm going to evaluate it. So there's lots of commercial style guides available. Some domains, some companies have style guides for their products. The web doesn't have a particular style guide, though a couple people have tried to write them, but we do have conventions. And so you can follow that. Here's some examples of things that come from style guides. And so looking at a product and making sure that they meet the guideline before you even test it can help you determine if you need to include a task. Yeah, I'm not talking to my watch. Tell you if you need to include a task or if you already have a finding before you've even started. We also know about a heuristic evaluation. I always tell people, my clients, if they come to me for a usability evaluation, they get a free heuristic evaluation, because we're going to look at the product using some set of heuristics, whether we're using one of the existing or our own, in order to determine whether or not there's some issues that we might want to look at in testing. So if somebody comes and wants to do a heuristic evaluation, pay for that, they get it. If somebody comes to me and wants a usability evaluation, I'm going to have to do a heuristic evaluation first. They'll get that as well. Just comes with the package. Another version of that is to do a cognitive walkthrough. It's just another approach to look at the product and see where you think problems are. I'll let you go back and read about this later. Again, I don't want to waste time on explaining some of these things. A full expert review is, some people will equate a heuristic evaluation to an expert review. But to me, an expert review involves doing all of that stuff. If you're an expert, then you understand the style guides and you know how to do a heuristic evaluation or cognitive walkthrough. But in addition, you've seen a lot of products in the field, you've evaluated them, and you can kind of predict, yeah, I've seen this in the past. It doesn't map nicely to a particular heuristic, but I've seen this attempt, and I know it's going to have some problems. So we learn a lot that's not necessarily described in any of these methods, and we'll use those as well. But the bottom line is that by the time you've looked at the product, you have some ideas of your own of where you think these problems are. And so when you select the task, you're going to have to consider these things that are known to be critical, right? They have to finish checkout, and we're not sure if they can. So we're going to make sure that we test that, make sure we evaluate the process of checkout if that's important, or the registration process, or whatever it is in the design that's critical. Now, if there's no problems there, or you don't believe there's any problems there, maybe you don't need to even include it. But sometimes it's good to just verify that if it's never been verified before. If they've made any changes to the design. Sorry, I hit the button again. Get back to where I was. We'll often be asked when we're doing it that, hey, we made this design change. And so, oh, if you made the design change, do you know if it worked or not? Because you were theoretically solving a problem, then we definitely should go back and check things that you've already changed. So that becomes a possibility of a task that you might include. If you found something during your evaluation that you are concerned about, I'm not sure if this is a problem or not, let's go get some user data and see if we can tell. You might want to include that. If there are things identified by the team, help desk, whatever, that says we get reports about this, obviously it's something you're going to explore. Now, back to this idea of quantitative versus qualitative evaluation. If we were doing a quantitative evaluation and we had a series of tasks, we either have to completely randomize those tasks, or we have to run those tasks exactly the same way for every single person in order for us to draw an accurate or valid conclusion. And we do not deviate. We cannot deviate, or that data is corrupted, which is why the EPA study that said, well, we'll test 4 features with this thermostat and 6 features with that thermostat and then compare them to each other, it doesn't make scientific sense. But if we're doing qualitative assessments, not only do we not care about the order, but we may do a couple of assessments, determine that not only did it verify there's a problem, but we've discovered what we think is the solution, and we're comfortable enough with the conclusion on the first couple of people that we're not even going to continue doing it for the rest of the testing or evaluation. We're going to do this something else. And so often when we come up with the list of tasks, we'll have some spares that we'll get to if we can knock some other stuff out, because we don't have to follow those rules of quantitative research, the big R research. But this is a negotiation often, and again, for my company, we're consultants. We have some products of our own that we've designed, but often we're brought to other people. They will tell us what they want to evaluate in the design, but we will do a review and then tell them things that we think should be evaluated as well. And so the project, for instance, I'm doing later today, the architecture of the site was all mapped sideways against itself. It cross-linked, it linked to subsections, it circular linked. And so we wanted to make sure that we evaluated that. So we came up with a series of tasks to see if that was as confusing as we thought it was going to be, in order to not only evaluate that, but have the data to present to our client. But the client didn't think there was any problem in the first place. So we negotiated that was something worth evaluating. If it's your design team that you're working with, then you may have the same thing. Well, you came up with the design, but when we looked at it, you came up with something here that we're not sure how well it's going to work. Is it okay if we go out and check that for you? And this is where a lot of design teams or development teams and the people who do the evaluations butt up against each other. AOL, which is right up the street from me in their heyday, they had a design team and they had a test team, and they hated each other. Because the design team said, well, those are just testers. They don't know anything about design. What are they doing telling us what to do? And the test team said, well, I don't understand why these people won't listen to us. We're the ones who know how to go out and get user data and know how to act on user data, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a real problem. You have to have a much better relationship. And if it's your own product, it's even harder because you have your own thoughts about what works and doesn't. You're not going to see if you believe it, it's not going to prove it otherwise. Anyway, we do follow the rules of experimental design in both cases, whether doing qualitative or quantitative research. And the aspects that we should know about in this is a couple of things. If you have the opportunity to compare two designs, you will learn a lot more than if you try to look at a single design, because you do have a comparison. You are able to say, I saw that this way of doing something worked better than that way. And so if you have the option of looking, and if you're doing design work, there are often cases where, or you're close enough to the design team, if it's not your own design work, where it's ironic that teams will say, well, we have to make a decision and move on, and say, well, you're trying to make a decision between two options. Why don't we go find out if one of those options is actually better? Maybe it's neither, maybe it's a combination. And so we should be able to do this. We should be able to take this opportunity to go out and look at design alternatives. If you're looking at a redesign, you might want to compare it to the old design to see that it's an actual improvement as opposed to just a different problem. And so there's a couple of ways you can do this, and just to focus on this aspect of experimental design. One is called between subject design. That's its original name, but I usually call it between group design. So you're interested in evaluating these two design alternatives, then you'll have a group of people try one of them, and then another group of people try the other one, and you'll see if there's any difference between those two groups. Now, the advantage of this approach is you can have as many designs as you want to evaluate. If you happen to have three, you come up with a third group. If you're testing two design alternatives against your original, you have three there as well. So you can grow the group as you need to. You're always comparing the difference between the groups, so you have to be careful that these groups are the same as each other. If you don't, then the differences that show up might be the groups and not the product, so you have to be careful. But the advantages here are that if you have an extensive product, something with a lot of features, then you'll have to give people enough time to work with the product. And so if you have multiple options, you might have to use this approach. If you're just testing a feature or two, and that's what you're really going after, you might want to prefer to do this in what's known as a within subject design or within group design. And in a within group design, what you do is you let them try one, and then you let them try the same group try the other. And the advantage here, of course, is that the group is homogeneous with itself, even if they're not representative of your total population. But they also get a chance to make a direct comparison of their own. And so this is another approach that we often use. But the difficulty in this one is sometimes using one product and then asking them to do the entire thing over again with another product can be a pain. And so we might not do it in a completely balanced fashion. Try all of these things, and then and then once you're done, check out these specific aspects of this other one that we're particularly interested in. Now that sounds like you're only evaluating one of the two designs. And the reason why you're not is because the other thing you need to do is you have to worry about the order in which you present things. When somebody uses one product and then tries a second product, what they learned on the first one will influence their thoughts on the second one, positively or negatively. And so half of your group should do it in the other order, and that gives you the chance to test them out sort of fairly. But most of the time, and this is the thing that's ironic, is we're really testing a single design. You know, you're looking at a product, and the first time you do this, I mean, what are you comparing it to? How do you know that this is good enough? You're waiting for a fail, then that's probably something you should have got long before you bring in users. So you don't have anything compared to. There's no actual baseline in usability data, but the problems that encountered, if you can equate them to something, if you can figure out why they occur, then they become more significant. And this is one of the things that I want to focus on with the difference between quantitative and qualitative research again, is in quantitative research, all of our data is all of our findings is the data we collect. It's analyzed, it's run through mathematical models, it's run through statistical evaluations, and it is the data. But when it comes to doing usability evaluations in a qualitative fashion, the data is what we can convince somebody why it happened. It is not what the user did, it's why do we think they did it? They may have done it because they were nervous. And that's why they did it in this situation, and don't worry about it. They may have done it because we asked it in a funny way and they didn't realize what we're asking. They really didn't do what we asked them to do, and that's not their fault. It's not the design's fault, I meant, because it's never their fault. But if we see something that happens, we need to understand why it happened. And if we hear somebody say something, remember that it's probably confabulated data, and we need to know, why did they say that? If they say, oh, well, this thing is XYZ, they may be saying, you know, this thing is way too complicated. And what they may be saying is, this thing is labeled wrong, this thing is organized wrong, this thing is visually poor, but they just describe it as complicated. So we have to interpret that. Everything is going to rely on us and our interpretation of what we collect. And one of the terms that bothered me a lot, or still does sometimes, because I don't hear it quite as often, but I'm referring to what the user says is a real finding and what I think is not. And the reality is, what I think happened and why is the only real finding, because users can't evaluate product performance and their own performance at the same time, and they're not designers, and they don't know what's happening or why. And so we shouldn't be paying that much attention to what they say. We're more interested in what they do and if we can explain what they do. And this is what makes usability evaluations difficult, is that we're putting ourselves out there. We're not relying on data. Oh, no, look, this is what the user said. You need to do it. One of my favorite client comments to me was, you're not going to tell me to do something just because 8 people said so. I said, absolutely not. In fact, I might tell you to do something that nobody comments on or even encounters, but I'll try to convince you why you need to do it based on psychological construct, standards and best practices, any number of things that I can convince you on. But we're not waiting for users to tell us what's wrong with a product. Paperwork's very simple, but I do want to cover it real quick. An important thing to know in paperwork is that you need to have informed consent to work with participants. I work on government projects, and generally government projects follow this rule, though the government did make some changes some years ago where they said, oh, it's just a typical usability evaluation. You don't need to go through an IRB to make sure that it's okay. And I'm like, oh my goodness, really? What about the psychological danger? What about the people who aren't trained in the ethical treatment of human subjects? We need to follow these rules. And so all of my students, I make them take an ethical treatment of human subjects training class. Even when I'm teaching the system engineering department or an IT group, because I want them to know that this is an important thing that we have to factor in. So if you haven't used one before, I encourage you to look at informed consents. You can grab one off the web. The most important aspect of this is participation is voluntary. They can stop anytime they want. I've seen people running studies, bringing in participants, and they're getting uncomfortable. And not only do they not notice it, but if they do say something, the person running this study will say, well, we're almost done. Why don't we go ahead and finish? I was like, no, you cannot do that. You're violating the person's rights. So if you've never done, if you're new to this, or even if you're not, if you don't use informed consent, please, I implore you, look them up. You can get free ethical treatment of human subjects testing or training. Please follow the rules and please use that. It's very important. But the other one is a facilitator's guide, and it is a guide. It has to have these introductory comments. It might have some pre-assessment questionnaires, questions that you might ask people before you start the actual evaluation. You're going to keep all of your task descriptions there. You're going to have some possible post-assessment questionnaires. And then if you want to collect some opinion data, which we almost always want to because they're there and it's a nice way to wrap up, whatever questionnaire you're going to use, the SUS, the Cooper Harbor, the SUMI, the quiz, Why document all this stuff? Well, you want to make sure you cover everything. And because it's a guide and not a script, I'm all over the place. My poor note takers have to track what's going on in the session. So if a participant goes in a particular direction and it's natural to flow from that to a particular task, we'll do it even if it's task 5. But as we reach the end of the session, I'll go back and make sure that if we haven't touched on one of them, that we go back and touch them. Because again, we want this to be as natural for the participant as possible. And so we let them lead the way through the design, steering them to things we want to check out as needed. Introductory comments are important. One of my clients likes to use an icebreaker. It's not the, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? But they have a question that they ask them in order to start a dialogue. I don't like to do that myself. I like my introductory comments to do that, but keep them in the context. And one of the ways that I do that is, and it's whether it's true or not, I use the same line, is first I'll say to them, here's what we're going to be doing today. You're going to be using the site. You're going to be trying it out. You're going to be, blah, blah, blah. There's 2 important things to know when you use this product. One is that I'm evaluating the product. I'm not evaluating you. And for me, I have a very simple rule. This is the little part that I put in there to kind of break the ice for us, is I'll always say, my rule is very simple. If you're working with me, you can't make any mistakes and you're never wrong. Now, that's said in a number of ways in most facilitators' guides, but the reason I kind of break from the formal and say that in the way that I say it is you'd be surprised how many people giggle when I say that. And they say, yeah, that's great. I wish I had that in my office, or something like that. We're building some rapport by having this dialogue, this look, don't worry about it. You can't make a mistake with me. And I'm saying it in a more personal way than this simple, we're evaluating design and therefore you can make no mistake. Your answer is always right. We want you to be honest. It's very formal the way most of them are written. And so that's one thing I do. And then the other thing that I like to do is I'll always say to them, and again, whether it's true or not, I didn't design this thing. You're not going to hurt my feelings. And the number of times, it's probably, if people giggle at the first one, 90% of people will outright laugh at the second line. And they may later say, you did X or you did Y, thinking that they're talking about my design when they are or not. But having that moment of saying, look, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I didn't design this thing. And they giggle and I know that we're making a connection, because that's going to be important when we're doing an assessment, because I want them to open up to me. I'm asking them to try a product while I'm watching them and possibly stumble because I put them in front of the things that I think might be a problem. And I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. So I need to establish this relationship immediately. So those are the test artifacts that you'd always have, even if you never look at the guide. If by the end of a number of people, I'm not looking at the guide very much. At the end of evaluation, I might pick it up and say, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. But I've probably done enough of them now that I remember every task we're supposed to cover. But I always have a guide and I always have it there. It's a nice thing to keep around. Now, we're finally at the point where we can talk about, oh, good, we still got another hour 10. I'm not doing a break because we only had 3 hours, but you guys can obviously take a break if you need. We've already talked about quantitative assessment. I put that aside. That's something you do after you're done. You'll probably be involved more in qualitative than quantitative assessments. The qualitative assessments, I want to talk about 2 different protocols. Now, I have a book on my bookshelf over here called The Handbook of Human Factors Test and Evaluation. There's probably 60 different evaluation methods in there. I also have a book on my shelf that's about 3 inches thick on doing a think aloud protocol. Okay. If you know of any protocol or heard of one, you might have heard of the think aloud protocol. And so I want to talk about it and explain its significant and severe limitations and why you shouldn't use it, except under specific conditions. And then you've got to be careful with what you get back. So let me try to convince you of that. So the idea of the think aloud protocol, this is a quote that it's a direct observation method that involves asking users to think out loud as they perform a task. Now, I emphasize that. We're going to get back to it in a second. User asked to say whatever they are looking at, thinking, doing, and feeling at each moment. And then the italics I added, it's especially useful for determining their expectations and identify aspects of the system that are confusing. Now, think about what we just talked about and the idea of conscious processing and unconscious processing. And now think about the idea that you're asking them to perform a task while talking. So you're asking them to perform a task and talk about performing a task. So you're asking them to do two tasks at the same time. And what do we know about doing two tasks at the same time? Well, if you're trying to do two things, it's not the same as trying to do one. You're splitting your attention. And so this is making the task they're trying to perform difficult. Secondly, it says whatever they're looking at, well, I know what they're looking at because they're dealing with it. And looking at something is not particularly useful because you can look right at something, as we saw with the moonwalking bear, and not notice it. And you can actually pick up things in your peripheral vision without ever looking at it. So that's kind of dubious. But what they're thinking, we've already talked about the fact that what they're thinking should be what they're thinking about consciously to perform the task, not what they're thinking about doing with the design. But then it says what they're doing, and I can see what they're doing. And now we want them to tell us what they're feeling as well. Asking them to do all of this has an interesting effect in that we're asking them to give you unfiltered insight into their psychology, which they're A, incapable of doing. They can't introspect. And B, it's none of your damn business how somebody feels about something. And so what happens, and this was demonstrated through the use of a layered voice stress analysis, which is an automated process looking at voice patterns. And a colleague of mine who was had layered voice stress analysis capability, I gave him a couple of studies, some with and some without Think Aloud protocol. And he didn't know what they were, and neither does the software. But what the software reported was that anybody doing a Think Aloud protocol shows first signs of split attention, which we know. Secondly, increased anxiety because they're not filtering what they say. You would hope that when you talk to a person, they think before they speak. We're asking people who we don't know, who are trying to do a task that they may not be familiar with, that we particularly gave them because it might be difficult, and to spontaneously tell you their thought process, which raises their anxiety, which affects their performance. So the Think Aloud protocol itself is disruptive to the natural behavior of what we're doing. And not only that, if you're asking for what they're looking at and doing, you're asking them to consciously pay attention to the design, which we learned earlier is supposed to be transparent. They're not supposed to think about the design. They're supposed to just operate with the design without ever even consciously being aware of it. And so though this protocol was developed, it was developed at IBM back in 70 something or other. All of these issues with it means that this is a very dangerous protocol to use and assume that anything you're getting back is going to be useful. You do have to use it under certain conditions. And so if you have a product that is just in its earliest phases, it's just a concept, or you just have a static screen or two, then sure, you can evaluate a storyboard, you can evaluate a static mock-up, although it's so easy to make dynamic ones, it's hardly worth testing a static mock-up anymore. But everybody is predicting their behavior based on these static mock-ups. And we know that what they're going to do at speed when they're working in a natural environment at pace and not stopping and thinking about it is unlikely to match what they're saying. So anytime you use this protocol, it should be on something that you can't test any other way. It's static. And secondly, the data you get back, you have to be careful that they're speculating future performance of their own. And so I have to tell you that there are very few occasions it's probably been 40 years since I've done a Think Aloud protocol, unless my client demanded it. And I have had clients who demanded I do a Think Aloud protocol. But what's interesting when you do a Think Aloud protocol that demonstrates what I'm talking about is I recall one time, in certain cases, let me give you a little backstory here. In some occasions when I'm doing an evaluation, I'll wear an earpiece because it's a domain that I don't know very well. And so, if we're dealing with accounting data, I don't know a lot about accounting. And so sometimes I get asked a question that I don't necessarily know the answer to. So what I'll do is I'll wear a headset, and then my client in the back can pass me the answer that I'm asked about, or something to say that makes sense to them when they ask me a question I don't know. And so I'm in a situation, my client's in the back room, able to talk to me, and they told me I had to use the Think Aloud protocol. And the rule of consulting is pretty simple. You can recommend once to your client that what they're doing is wrong, but if they tell you twice, unless it's illegal or unethical, do it. So I was going to do it. So here's a person in there working away, and then something happened, and they're talking to me. They're trying to think out loud, and it looks like I'm supposed to do X, Y, and Z. Huh? And all of a sudden they stop talking, and they're looking at the screen like, what is that? Now, to me, this means that something happened on the screen that caused them to get distracted from talking, because something on the screen is important enough that they have to focus on it exclusively. This is a finding in my study. This is some event occurred that distracted them because they don't know what to do at this moment. So I'm waiting for them to figure it out. In the meantime, my client's in the back room yelling in my ear, he's not talking. Make him say something. He's supposed to talk while he's doing this. I'm like, no, I'm waving in the background. No. Let this poor guy finish what he's doing. He's trying to figure it out. When he figured it out, he then started talking again, demonstrating that you can't think and talk at the same time. And when he had to think, he had to stop talking. So let's talk about the protocol that does make sense. Remember that the idea is that a user is given a task, they should be focusing on accomplishing that task. They should be able to do this task with this product without having to stop thinking about the task and thinking about how the heck does this product want me to interact with it. And for that reason, we use a protocol, and I know a lot of people have kind of morphed into this protocol without thinking about it. They don't really do a think aloud, but they claim to. They don't make people talk as often as the protocol suggests. But we've always called it an interrupted task-based protocol. And it works like this. If I ask you to perform a task and you can do it, we're done. If I said to you, this is an application to locate stuff, see if you can find the nearest Starbucks, and you just blah, 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 find the nearest Starbucks, I don't need to talk to you. I don't need you to explain anything. You just blazed through it and you did fine. And I get a spelling error. But what we're looking for is, when does the interface stop being something they can interact with unconsciously and become something that they're consciously aware of? And so we're looking for, when does their attention shift to the design of the software? And so when they're performing the task, if everything's fine, let them go, move on. But if during that task you observe something that suggests there might be a problem here, you're going to need to stop them at that moment and see if you can figure out what's going on. Why at that moment? Because afterwards they won't remember it. Do you remember when you were doing the task, at this point you went, ooh, oh, and then you moved on? I did? No, I don't remember doing that. Well, you did it right here. And then they'll confabulate a rationale for it. You have one moment of opportunity when this occurs to try, and it's only an attempt, because again, if you ask them, do you know what happened right here? But we're going to do our best to see if we can figure out, why did they get distracted at this moment? Why were they no longer focused on the task? What drew them into the interface? Yeah, I wasn't sure what to do next. And then I realized that I wasn't scrolled down the page yet. So I scrolled down and saw the action button. Oh, okay. So the problem was that there was no action button on the screen at that moment. And you know what happened because you were aware of it. So, and you told me, and I agree with you. That's what I just watched happen. So there's a case where we got some good data. If you say to them, it looked like you clicked here and then you got distracted and you came back, do you know what distracted, what got you to go there? Well, I probably just didn't read the word carefully. Okay, if they say probably, they don't know why they did what they did. Don't take them at face value. But there's something wrong. That's what we know. So when we interrupt the person, depending on how what happens in that discussion, we might discover the problem if it makes sense, but more than that, if we agree with it, if it fits an expectation of something that we can tie it to. But if they say something that we're not certain about, it sounds like they're just, they're not sure, they're maybe rationalizing it, then maybe we need to do this with another person, see them do it and see what they say. And eventually we might figure out what's going on, but don't rely on them to give you your answer. And so this protocol may require, this is why if we've interrupted people at a certain point and we've discovered the problem, we may not interrupt the next person. Well, yeah, we know it's a problem. We've seen it. We've already talked about it with everybody else. They're going to hit it too, but we don't need to waste time with that because we can get on to other things. We might even tell them what to do at that point. That would violate every rule of quantitative research. We're helping the participant. Hey, listen, when you reach this point and you see that button, I think that label's wrong. It should be this. So just assume it says that. Well, we just help them. Aren't we violating the rules? No, we know that's a problem and we're going to fix it, but we don't want it to be a problem in this person. We want to get on to other stuff. So go ahead and tell them. The difficult part for facilitators in this session is knowing when to interrupt, knowing when to interrupt a person, and then knowing when to help them and how to help them. Pauses are really hard to deal with. We are uncomfortable. It's the pregnant pause. It's the uncomfortable silence. You need to let a person think their way through the problem and then interrupt them. You don't interrupt them while they're in the middle of it unless you have to. And so this particular approach, we get semi-accurate performance data for anything that doesn't have a design problem, but we're free to explore areas where we think there are design problems. But the skill that you have to develop is this one of, what are you observing? Are you observing a problem? There's some people who are great at poker and they show no signs of what you want. There's other people who are so expressive that you can tell every bit of confusion, but everybody's different and you need to learn the patterns. A person hits a page and they're confused, they lean back. Huh? Another person hits a page and they're confused and they lean in. What? Both tell you the same thing, but they're very different behaviors. So teaching the skill set is simple. Practicing it enough that you become proficient at it and you become expert at it at some point will take some time. Unlike the Think Aloud protocol, where you write down everything the person says and say, that's my result. That's why that protocol is so successful. We believe it's valuable data. It's very simple to do. You can be trained in a moment and you can practice it immediately at the same level as you can practice it 5 years later. This protocol is going to require some work to be good at. And the nice thing is you can do this on anything. You can do this on a partial interactive mock-up that you've put together. You can do it on a completed design that you've got put together. You can do it on a piece of prototype software. You can take it on a fielded product. This protocol works everywhere. So let's talk about the process of facilitating an interrupted task-based protocol. We will be using the active listening skills developed originally by Carl Rogers, famous psychologist in the world of humanistic psychology. But he had 3 principles that he said, before you can do active listening, there's 3 things you have to keep in mind. First of all, you have to have unconditional positive regard. This is a human being and you have to have you can't treat them like a data source, impersonal. You have to have positive regard to them as a fellow human being. I've seen people facilitate evaluations where like, okay, do this. All right, great. Okay, now do this. Okay, you found it. Okay, good. Let's do that. And I was like, that's a human being sitting next to you. Treat them as such. Treat them as another human being. You have to be personable. You can't act like, okay, great. I'm done with you. You're done. Go away. I want my next person. And I've seen people who are so worried about collecting the data and stuff that they kind of forget that that's a human being. And if you do, you can miss a lot of stuff that's going on. You have to pay attention to them, not only because they're another human being, because you're looking for what's going on inside of them. When are they getting confused? When are they getting frustrated with something? When are they pleased? When are they struggling? All of these things you have to pick up through empathy. Watching the screen is not going to tell you what's going on. And this is why the last year of having to do usability evaluations on the web and in this format is hard, because most of the data that I'm looking for is coming across from sitting next to a person and feeling what's going on. And it doesn't come across on the web. And most of the time, if you're doing a government project, you're not allowed to record the person's face. So if I want to record the session for note-taking purposes, I can't even have their camera on. And so we need to be able to empathize. Now, if you've done enough in lab testing with somebody, if you've been next to a person for a bunch of evaluations, and then you do one online, you'd be surprised that you can pick up when that same thing is occurring on the web without the data that you would expect, because you've encountered it before and you're saying, I wonder if it's going on at the moment. I know when people paused at this point, what was happening, so maybe that's happening here. But it all relies on your ability to empathize with what the person is doing and whether that is a struggle or not, because that's what we're really looking for. I always say the data is not on the screen, it's on the user's face or body language. And we have to be careful. Congruence is a fancy name for being internally consistent. The concern about the participant and potentially arguing with them or disagreeing with them runs us afoul. Remember that you've invited a person in that you're going to sit and work with who probably doesn't know you. You have no personal relationship, and they're feeling evaluated. No matter how many times you tell them we're testing the product, not you, they are the one performing. You're asking them about their performance. They're going to feel evaluated. And they have their radar turned way up. So they're very attuned to you. Did I do this right? Am I following the instructions correctly? Is this person really evaluating me? And so if you convey anything to them that suggests that you're not being honest, you're going to break this thing. You're going to break the relationship. This is going to fall apart on you. Now, it's not going to fall apart and they're going to jump up and run out of the room. But you're going to reach a point where they're not comfortable expressing to you. And when this happens, usually in these, is that somebody says, yeah, that was really simple. And you can hear in their voice when they say that it wasn't simple at all. In fact, I watched them struggle. And then you say, well, what do you think of that? And thinking that they're going to tell you of the difficulty, and they go, oh, that was fine. Oh, there was nothing wrong with that. And if you say, okay, I'm glad it was easy, they're picking up on the fact that they're lying, that they're trying to hide from you. They're not lie to you in a sense, but they're trying to keep from you what they're saying. And not only are you not picking up on it, but you're answering it back. But when you answer them back, they know that you don't believe them. And so you've just ruined this rapport you're trying to create. But imagine, and this is what makes active listening not only active, but powerful, is imagine that you got this moment to cut through and say, that's interesting. I mean, I heard you say that you thought that was simple, but it seemed like it really wasn't that easy to do. You've connected with what they were really telling you in a cautious way. You've made a connection through the barrier, and they will go, oh goodness, I'm actually being heard. Somebody's actually listening to me. I can now express myself. I remember one time doing an evaluation behind a glass. We had a one-way glass behind us. By the way, it's a one-way glass. It's not two-way glass. Two-way glass is a window. So it's a one-way glass. It's a mirror on one side, on our side, but people can see through it. And there are a dozen people in the back room. And as part of informed consent, I did tell them that, there might be people watching in the back, but don't worry about them. And it was pretty clear that this person was uncomfortable because he didn't like this product at all. And the people in the back room were there, and he knew he was being observed, and I could feel that he just wanted to get it out. And so finally, after reflecting this back to him a couple of times. I said, you really don't like this, do you? And he said, you know what? It sucks. And when he said that, the people in the back room cracked up because they all thought it sucked too. And the minute that they laughed, you could just see him go, oh, thank goodness. And then he opened up and the rest of the session went very smoothly. We need to break through that initial, I don't know you, I'm not sure what you're really doing. I know what you said, but we need to connect, and congruence is the way to connect to it. Never try to hide if you think that they're saying something different than what they're saying, because they'll pick up that you're not honest anymore. So that's a real important one in that. Empathy is just as important in the sense that you have to be able to empathize, but you have to keep this bridge open between the two of you. Now, given those three principles, you walk in the door with this assumption that, boy, I'm glad that this person's here. I'm going to treat them with respect. I'm going to try to feel through them what's really going on while they're trying this product. And I'm going to make sure that I don't send any message that I'm being dishonest to them. Then the techniques become pretty straightforward. The first thing you do is you have to stop them, and then you need to get them to talk. And so we do that through what's called an open-ended question. The difference between an open and a closed-ended question is a lawyer uses a closed-ended question. How far away were you from the incident when it happened? They're waiting for you to answer, and as soon as you answer, they stop talking. 20 feet, and then they wait for the next question, because you've closed the dialogue with a closed-ended question. How many times have you visited this website? I've never visited this website. Or even better, how have you ever visited this website? The answer is yes or no. You're not looking for an elaboration. Those are closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions are a way to hand the dialogue to the other person. And so person's dealing with something and said, and goes, ooh, and say, that's interesting. You just went, ooh, what did ooh mean when you said that? Or why did you say ooh? Now there's the dreaded why question, but that's the way to hand the conversation to them. I'm going to give you this conversation because I want you to talk about it. I'm not going to tell you what I think, ask you if this is what's going on. I want you to discuss it for a minute and see if I can figure out what's happening for you. Once they start talking, then you have to do two things. You have to encourage them to continue talking. This is the classic psychologist, nod your head. Sometimes I'll go like this to say, keep going. Anything that you can do to keep them talking, right? Okay, I see. Look right at them. Don't take notes. If you're taking notes while they're talking, you're not paying attention to them. You need to look them in the eye and have them explain to you and keep them going. And while they're going, you're going to reflect back things of interest. Yeah, it was really confusing. That was confusing. Yeah, so the word said this, but when I got there, it said that, and that didn't make sense to me. Okay, so, or blah, 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 and you go, wow, this person's feeling really frustrated. You reflect frustration. You sound frustrated. Now, sometimes these will come across, you'll think that you're challenging them. But the reality is that if you've made this connection to them and you're having this dialogue in the right way, this doesn't come across as a challenge. You said, are you angry? Their answer is no, always. Are you angry? No, of course not. But if you say, this is making you angry, then it's sort of a question, it's a reflection of what you're feeling. And they say, well, I'd say I'm more frustrated than angry. They'll correct you rather than become defensive at a challenge or a statement made to them. So a reflection is truly reflect what you're receiving from them. If you're receiving frustration, say, you seem frustrated. If they say, this was confusing, you can just say, this was confusing. It sounds stupid to repeat the words back, but it's amazing how many people live their lives without getting even that much reinforcement from another person that they're being heard. And repeating their words says, I hear you. So use it. This is the most difficult skill to use. An and a nod of the head is pretty simple, but learning the proper reflection and practicing it will be difficult. So that's one of the skills that you'll practice a lot before you feel comfortable with it. But then there comes a point where we are in charge of what's going on here. We have a bunch of tasks we want to get done, and we can't just sit here and talk about this forever. So you need to wrap up. So you need to stop them at a given moment, give them the conversation, hear the dialogue, encourage it, reflect as you need to. When you have what you need, summarize it, get them back to work. All right, so I noticed that you clicked on that first button there, you went to that page, immediately came back and clicked another button. Do you know what happened right there? Well, yeah, that first button, when I saw it, I saw this word and that meant this, and then I went over there and I looked at the page, but when I got to that page, it didn't seem to be what I was looking for, so they don't match. No, the word up front said this, but the content seems to be saying that, so I thought the content was this, and that's not what that word is. Okay, so that was confusing. Yeah, it was. And so, okay, great. So maybe that label needs to be changed, and we can certainly look at that. All right, great. Let's move on to another task. Give them the conversation, let them explore, steer them as you need to, and when you're done, wrap it up, put it on a bow, put it on a shelf, let them go to the next task. Do this over and over again throughout the session. There may be, if it's a great product, I could go 10, 15 minutes without ever interrupting. Say, okay, that's great. Let's do the next task. I had a session, the session we're going to be reviewing at 4 today. The last participant completed the entire thing in 25 minutes. They were done. We had an hour scheduled. They were done in 25 minutes. They did nothing except perfect performance. But the first person took a full hour, and some of the people, we didn't even get through all of the tasks. And in those 30 minutes, I barely said a word because they just were able to do it. And it realized that a healthcare professional with a lot of computer experience was not going to have problems with this website. That was the conclusion. And we learned that in 30 minutes. So you sometimes don't have to facilitate much at all, but other times there might be a lot of things that happen that you need to talk about. And so back to this idea of findings. So what are our findings? Well, our findings are occasions when this occurred that we saw an event, and ideally we know why that event occurred, and even better, we can help you figure out what you might be able to do to improve it. We don't need everybody to do something to say it's a finding. You don't need to watch every person walking by the hump trip over the hump in the rug to say that hump in the rug is a problem. One person can demonstrate it. Everybody missing it, you can still say everybody missed it in this case, but I think they were just lucky and we need to fix it anyway. It's up to you to determine whether this is an important finding or not based on what you observed. Nobody has to even find it or encounter it. Remember, we can't evaluate every single aspect of the site. And so if you looked at the site and discovered something and you didn't decide to include it in the evaluation, it's still a finding, but you're going to have to defend yourself. And you might have to convince whoever you're giving this information to that this is the case, that because you can notice something and equate it to an industry standard best practice, a style guide violation, a prior experience, and a violation of some psychological construct, whatever you use, it's still a finding. And we shouldn't shy away from giving them more data than participants provided at that given moment. There is a tendency to want to give counts. Most people, some people, 3 of 9. The problem with giving this is it seems like it's adding credibility, but it also makes us try to think that what we're looking at is quantitative data. We saw participants do this is really what you want to say. No participant actually did this, but if every participant did it, sure, maybe you want to say that. We did an evaluation and we brought in experienced users and said, of the 32 people who used the product, not one of them had ever noticed or used the breadcrumbs. So there was a case where we tied it into not only the participants, but the exact number of participants, because that was pretty amazing finding that 32 people with experience, when they were showed the breadcrumbs, I said, that's funny. I've been using this site for years. I've never noticed it had breadcrumbs. So that was worth reporting. But don't get caught up don't fall into the trap of converting qualitative data into an attempted quantitative evaluation in order to lend credibility. 4 of the 5 participants did this, therefore it must be done. No, it's 4 of the 5 of these participants, non-randomly sampled, non-homogeneous population in a disruptive protocol is not worth talking about. And anybody with a statistical background is going to call you on it. User comments are good as long as you don't rely on them as these are real findings, as long as maybe, you know, this was confusing to the point where one participant even said this, right? That's some reinforcement of your finding. But just writing down what somebody says and peppering your report with a bunch of user quotes. Well, we don't have enough user quotes in here. We rarely include user quotes. This particular client I keep referring to back, I'm actually a subcontractor to a client, and they said, well, can you go find some quotes to add to your report? And I thought, oh, sure, because you know that's important to you. But frankly, we rarely ever worry about those things. A compelling comment by somebody on occasion is useful, but again, it's 9 people. It's less than 9 people. It's not significant to report that. And if you think that the designer had a problem, or if the designer came up with this and thought this design was good, and then you went out and found problems with it, don't assume that they're going to then come up with the right answer because they came up with this answer and thought it was okay. So if you can, tie it into recommendations. Maybe you can't give a recommendation. Maybe you can give a general recommendation. Sometimes you can give an explicit recommendation. But the number of people I've seen who give a report that says, here's what happened, go fix it. What good is that? I mean, can you help me fix it? And luckily, as people have been more comfortable, they say, well, will you give us recommendations on what we can do? Because obviously they want some help. So don't shy away. It's one of the reasons why we as evaluation people should be versed in design, because it will help. And where AOL ran into this problem when they crafted their corporate organization is the design people were designers, but the evaluation people were evaluators, and they didn't know a lot about design, and they couldn't give recommendations. And that's one of the reasons why the design team didn't really like the evaluators, because they said they don't know anything about design. So why are they even doing this work? But they weren't hired for their design skills. So you may have a person who's an evaluator who is not good enough to do good design. It's not necessarily their specialty. But even as a designer, you may not be good enough to code because you don't know enough code, but you know enough to be able to talk to coders. So we need to know enough if that's going to be your specialty. And sometimes designers can be good evaluators, and sometimes their design skills get in the way because they see the design and they're more focused on that than actually evaluating. Okay, so there's a balance point in there, but we shouldn't be so separate that these are foreign worlds to us. And we're still doing good on time. I'm thrilled because this is the first time I've ever done this particular webinar or tutorial in 3 hours. So again, remember that you are the source of the findings, not the participants, not their comments. It's always what you can tell happened and your ability to defend why that's the case, and ideally some ideas of what you can do about it. That is ultimately the goal of qualitative assessment. Is there a problem? And if so, can we try to figure out a solution? Now, the last thing to talk about is this idea of satisfaction data. And so satisfaction data is an interesting beast because remember that it's an opinion. Okay, so satisfaction data is based on people's opinions. This data cannot come from anybody but the participants. So it's not something you can do in an expert review. You can predict that people will say that they're not satisfied or satisfied, but the only actual satisfaction data comes from participants. But it rarely correlates with their actual performance. That doesn't mean we don't want it. That doesn't mean we don't collect it. This particular product I keep alluding to, that's a federal website, the participants learned tons of stuff. They were like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, that's great. I didn't even realize that this organization even had this information. They were very satisfied with what they learned, but they weren't able to do it successfully. If they tried it and then went back to find it again, they couldn't find it a second time. They found some of the data, but they didn't realize that there was other data that they would also be interested in. There was a different part of the science they didn't even know about. So their lack of good performance, because this design was really difficult to understand and was broken up, and segments segments of data were split across the place, didn't affect the fact that they learned something, and they were very satisfied at this point. Now, we can make their satisfaction even greater if they would learn everything and if they could do it repeatedly, but that doesn't affect their current satisfaction. So it also is nice as long as the person's there. I mean, come on, let's talk about unconditional positive regard. You got a person there and you don't ask them their opinion? That's craziness. So we always ask their opinion at the end of the evaluation. You can get it in a number of ways. You can operationalize it, but remember, it is an opinion. Opinions are not numerical. You cannot average opinions. If you want to use a standard instrument, you can get numbers out of these standard instruments. The SUS, the most common ways to do this, gives you a value between 1 and 100. But don't report the average and say the average of the SUS score was X, because it's opinions, and opinions aren't averageable. They are, they're neither, I'm going to forget the terms while we're here talking. They're not an interval. My 5, the difference between my 4 and 5 is not the same as your difference between 4 and 5. My 4 is not your 4. If you want to test this theory out, try this sometime. Next time you're on Amazon, read a review and predict what the star rating was, and then look at the star rating. And I'm pretty sure that it won't take you long to discover that you read a review and go, my God, this person thinks this is a piece of crud. This is the worst product they've ever seen in their life. And then you look and say, why the heck did they give it a 4? I mean, how bad could it be to get a 1? Or you'll read something that sounds pretty blasé, and you know, it's like, oh, it seemed like it was okay to them, but they gave it a 1. It didn't sound like it's anywhere near that bad. Okay, they run into in data collection circles not ethnography. Anyway, it doesn't matter what the term is. These are things known as strictness, leniency bias, the halo effect, central tendency bias. They're all the nature of people, and you're not getting enough people. Think of it this way: we're all like snowflakes. Okay, we may all be snowflakes, but every snowflake is different. The only way to get a snowball is to use a lot of snowflakes. And so if you're getting data from a handful of people and they're all snowflakes, you've just got a handful of snowflakes to deal with. Until you have thousands and thousands of data points, and you can then start to eliminate the number of people with leniency versus strictness bias, and those people who have central tendency bias, and wipe out the halo versus the negative halo effect, then you can start talking about averages, but not when you use a small number of people. The best way to look at this data is going to be to plot it. But if you did, for some reason, want to come up with some kind of analysis of this data, it's not from using a simple thing like an average, which is based on parametric statistics. There is a non-parametric approach to looking at satisfaction data. It's called a Wilcoxon rank sum analysis. And so if you did ask people their opinion, and it was on a scale like this, which is a 7-point Likert scale, and then you take that data and you run the hypothesis saying whether you believe that it was positive or negative, and then you have to run through some mathematical formulas of determining both the positive and negative value, W1 and W2, and then you have set your level of significance, and then you look at the delta between the positive and negative rating and their absolute value, and then you eliminate those that are replicated or zeros, and then you end up with a score, and then you take that score and you look it up on a table, and you determine whether or not you can say with statistical certainty that there's a 95% probability that within this population more people found it positive than negative. Wow, that was great. You did an awful lot of work to draw that conclusion. But remember what the whole idea here is that you're getting data so that you can think about it and make some determinations. And so if you were to plot the data instead, and you were to discover that, well, it's interesting, of the audience that we had here, several of them really loved the product, but everybody else kind of gave us a representation of the product that looks kind of like a normal bell-shaped distribution. Is there a reason I can think of why that would have occurred? What is it about the people who really liked it that would do that? Is it just because they oh, I remember those people. They were trying really hard to give positive results back. They seemed like they were very concerned about saying negative about this. So that could just be an anomaly of the people who are recruited, that they were unsure to give negative ratings. I saw them behave negatively, but when we asked them, they gave really positive results. So that's probably just an anomaly. We shouldn't worry about it. And this thing is really an average product. I recall one time we were evaluating a product that was designed to replace something for a group of people who were really supposed to be IT people. So the product was to manage email addresses and all of this domain stuff. And the problem was that a lot of the people who were assigned that responsibility had no technical background. And so they tried to design it in a way that made it really simple for people to do, and they succeeded. It was a very good design. But when we looked at the results, we saw that it was highly skewed positively. People gave it really good positive ratings, and there were 4 people who gave it terrible ratings. And so the question was, why would we get this weird pattern? And then we looked at the 4 negative ratings there, and they came from 4 IT professionals. And the conclusion was they probably rated really badly because it works perfectly for them. And this new interface not only looks dumbed down, but there's no reason to have to learn something new. And that's why they didn't think it was very good, because they didn't have any problems with it either. And everybody else who didn't understand IT really liked the product. So I think you got a good result here, regardless of the fact that 4 people gave you a really low score. Because again, it's not the data, it's our interpretation of a small data set. That's what we need to do. All right, we have finished with a half hour left. And I'm glad, I'm surprised, but I'm also glad. I'm glad because I want to open up to any questions, discussion. If we were in room, I'd try to do this once with you to show what an interrupt task-based protocol looks like. I did say I was going to talk about organizational structures, but I'm going to give you guys the time here to ask me any questions that you have. And I'm not sure how we're doing this either, technically. I think you can unmute yourself. I think there's probably a chat in here somewhere. Let's see. Get all if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to. If somebody wants to try to send me a chat and see if that works, just to test it. Oh, there's a chat right there. Cool. Let's see what's in the chat. So welcome. Keep your audio muted throughout the presentation. Oh, yes, I can share my email address. So my email address is long. It's my first initial, Bill, B, Killam, Killam, and then it's at this address right here, user-centereddesign.com. There's a usability problem for you. I have to constantly correct people on because they leave out the ED. How can I get recordings for the tutorial? I'm going to let somebody else answer that. Actually, I guess I should type in my address. Why am I looking at a chat, not using it? There. Oh, they're not in the meeting anymore anyway. Recordings will be available. Please ask questions using the chat feature. So it looks like we still have some people here, but I don't see any questions in chat. So either I covered everything perfectly or I confused you so much you don't have any questions. Any questions for me? Since you don't have any questions, the one I left out because I didn't think I'd have time to cover it was the idea of organizational structure. And one of the things I'll point out in that area is that since I do teach and I deal with a lot of students who are about to graduate, one of the things I tell them, if you want to, if you're interested in going to a company and you want to know whether they're going to do really good design work, one of the things you should look at is how they organize their designers and developers. I teach a course called User-Centered Design, or it's actually called Introduction to Human-Computer Interaction. But I teach the user-centered design process, and the principle is that designers and developers are not the same people. I don't believe in the designer-developer. There's way too much design work that goes on, and if you look at a typical website, you'll see things that developers don't produce. They don't produce written words. They're not content writers. They don't produce graphics. They go out and find graphics. So graphic artists and content writers are part of the design team. The one that we often miss that's part of the design team is the interaction designer, because you can't see interaction design, you experience it. And then the evaluators are evaluating very differently. Those people, those of us in doing evaluation have seemed to carve out a niche. But what's interesting when you talk to a company and you say, how are you organized? They'll have a software department and a graphic artist. And the graphic artist reports to software. And somehow they think that that's a good organizational structure. That doesn't work. You would expect to find, first of all, a full team consisting of interaction designers, visual designers, content specialists, if you're building hardware, industrial designers, and that team is responsible for design, but they're organizationally at the same level as development. Because one should not report to the other. There's a reason in this country we don't make one of the lawyers the judge. The judge in that situation should be somebody who is knowledgeable of both fields, but doesn't have a dog in either fight. And so if you elevate a person from the software side to be the lead, and there's a software team and a design team, guess what? Software is going to win every argument, because the person at the top appreciates software and its requirements, but doesn't necessarily appreciate what the design team is doing. If you take a designer and you put them up there, they're going to have the same problems. That design is everything to them, and they don't appreciate how difficult it is to build some stuff. So you need a true system engineer. In a lot of the projects that I work on, the person who's at that position has no technical experience. And so I do a lot of work with government clients. And so, we're working on the clinicaltrials.gov website, and they have an in-house group of developers. They've brought us in as an outside group doing design, and the project lead is an epidemiologist. Well, guess what? I can talk to an epidemiologist all day, and I can explain all sorts of psychology things to them, and they probably will get it. But when the developer comes in and gives them a reason why they can't do something that's way over their head because they don't understand anything technical, it doesn't matter what I told them. So that person not only has to be neutral, but they have to be smart enough to know, they have to have the domain knowledge in both disciplines to know when to push back and when to say, I appreciate your concern, but this is important. And it doesn't matter which direction it goes. I appreciate your design concern, but we can't get that done in the time allowed. You need to come up with something else that's feasible. Or I appreciate your issue in how much this is going to cost and to how difficult it's going to be to develop. But the value of it is so great from the design standpoint that you're going to have to put the work in to figure out a way to do this. That's the role of this person, and they have to be at that position. All right, any other questions for me? I feel bad that we're going to end early and you're not getting your full money's worth. All right. If you don't have any questions, you're free to go into the the breakout room. It's an interesting little room that's set up. I hadn't seen this before. I'd heard about them. But if you haven't been to the breakout room, you can wander around in the room, and where you go, that's how you'll determine who you can hear. So it's like being in a real room. You can go get a glass of wine, and I think you can go play checkers. Are there special tea? I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you do have any follow-up questions for me, the slides are available, the video's available. It was a lot of material, and I apologize if I went quickly, but I was, again, concerned. This course used to be 8 hours. Then it became 6 hours. This last year, because of COVID, was the first year in 20 years I did not give a full day tutorial. And this year they asked me, because we're remote, would I give it, but could I keep it to 3 hours? And so I tried to trim it down, and I was not 100% certain how well I was going to get timing. So I probably rushed a little bit. So if you do have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you about it. I will try to do my best to keep myself separated from my company, because there are times when I'm a professor and there's times when I'm a consultant. And so if you have a question and you want to talk to me, and it's not because you want a consultancy, I'm happy to give you any information I can to help you.
I think there's a question. Are there special things to concern with evaluating with people who have cognitive issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people think about accessibility as something different than providing access. And so when we're testing with a population that has some identified disability, whether it be hearing, vision, physical limitations, or even cognitive limitations, it's just a user population. Now, it is different that dealing with somebody with cognitive issues is going to be difficult to interact with them. And so your interpersonal skills come into play a little more. But it's fundamentally not that different. You just have to be aware of how to interact with a person who might have cognitive issues in the first place. And then it really becomes, how do they understand it? How do they perceive it? What do they find difficult? The rationale for it is going to be different. But it should be just considered another audience in some respects. Any other questions? You're welcome. Hope that was a good answer for you. Well, as the host here, I'm not going to be the first one to sign off, but if you guys are done, don't have any questions, you're welcome to sign off. I'm going to keep it running right until 4 when I have to get to my other meeting. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I heard that there's a hope to keep this format, not necessarily this exact format, but to make future open houses available on the web for people, because it'd be nice if one of the things we do take positively out of COVID is that we can get together in unique ways. We don't have to just get physically together. It's difficult for some people to travel. It's costly for some people to travel. And so my understanding is that there's a hope to keep an open channel for online participation in future events. So I'm sure they'd be interested to know if you thought that this worked well for you for that, if it continues.
Hi, I didn't get to introduce myself earlier. I am an incoming HCI student this year and absolutely looking forward to starting school. It was very, very nice attending the session. I
Excellent.
mean, the information was a lot for me to process because very new to all of this, but really, really nice.
Excellent. And you're going to be on campus starting in the fall?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I only teach occasionally for them as an adjunct. That means I'm on contract. The last course I taught was actually a remote class, so I haven't been up there in over a year. It'd be nice to get up there. But it's a beautiful campus, and I think you'll enjoy the time there. So
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
good. Well, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, the meeting just got over. You missed the session by some 5 minutes.